So, hello everyone. I'm Katie. I'm a PhD student based in Dundee, Scotland. And today I want to talk to you about using design as a tool to start conversations. I'm fascinated by how design can really open up dialogue around critical issues in our society. And I'm interested in devices that aid communication, specifically hearing aids. So we live in a society where we tend to associate hearing loss and deafness with aging, and even more pressingly, we don't really tend to talk a lot about disability. However, over 5% of the world's population have what the World Health Organization would call a disabling hearing loss, and 34 million of these people are actually children who are growing up deaf or hearing impaired. So I wanted to ask the room today, does anyone in here wear hearing aids? Or do you know someone who does? Friends, family? Yeah? Think of how you felt when you started wearing them. Think of how they felt. Not always, but quite often, the response to wearing hearing aids is negative. It's hiding them, covering them up, and oftentimes just refusing to accept and wear them. And it's no wonder this is a common response. Let's have a look at these devices that aid communication every day. As a room full of designers and the design interested, I think we can agree that they're pretty horrible, right? Yeah? They're not appealing things. You're not going to go to a shop and buy one deliberately. They're pretty gross. In fact, when I interviewed wearers of hearing aids and asked them what words came to mind when they looked at their own hearing aids, some responses were artificial, boring, clinical, chunky, horrible, and plastic. These designs seem to be really failing to represent the multitude of people who are actually wearing them. And there's two prominent narratives currently around the design of hearing aids. So firstly, there's the pseudo-skin-colored devices that are aiming to conceal themselves. And secondly, there's these metallic, almost robotic designs that seem to take design inspiration from consumer electronics and hint towards this idea of a bionic human future, where the idea is that eventually these will become so small that they'll be implanted. Yet another way of making deafness invisible. So in order to understand these narratives and the designs and why they exist, we need to look at disability theory. So for much of the 20th century, the medical model of disability has been the way in which we as a society view disability. And under the medical model, disability is seen as something to be treated, to be fixed, or if all else fails, concealed. So when we consider the design of hearing aids and indeed prosthetics generally, this outdated model of hiding, stigmatizing, covering still really remains prominent today. But thankfully, in the late 20th century, the social model of disability came into being. And the social model of disability argues that, unlike the medical model where it's an individual problem, it's not actually the different labeled person that's the problem that needs to be fixed or cured or solved. It's actually the barriers that have been put up by society, including educational, access, lots of different things that, make things not accessible to everyone. So for example, if a building or a space is inaccessible, it's not the wheelchair user there that's the problem. It's the lack of consideration to actually make this space accessible in the first place. So societal attitudes that are the real problem. So the social model of disability has acted as this incredibly powerful catalyst, empowering different labelled people to take back some of the power that the medical model really had stripped away from them. And with it, this has inspired designers to create these prideful statement designs that, again, opposite to the medical model, which aim to hide disability, actually try and draw attention towards this. So it's fair to say that these two models represent two ends of what is actually a spectrum. So how do real, living, breathing hearing aid wearers fit into these theoretical models that aim to categorize their individual and social identities? In my 2 years of volunteering with, interviewing, and using design as a tool to have and facilitate these conversations, I found that quite often they don't really. So, for example, there's Alice. Alice has worn a hearing aid since she was a child, and she spoke to me about how she's always covered it up ever since she was wee. I'll translate that. Wee is a Scottish word for young or small for an international audience. But now, recently, in her 20s, just about once a week, she'll wear her hair up to work. And then there's Benjamin. And Benjamin actually lied in his hearing aid test as a child to avoid getting a hearing aid, but speaks about how now as an adult, in his 60s, after wearing one for a few years, he's much more open about his communication needs. But this has been a really gradual process for him, and he's had to build a lot of confidence around this area. So this polarization we see represented in design between shameful or proud, hidden or statement designs doesn't actually reflect this whole group of wearers who, in their everyday life, are actually somewhere much more in this messy, nuanced middle ground, not wanting a whisper and not wanting a shout. And this is where my design practice steps in. What if these less polarized wearers don't need their hearing aids to be hidden or reconceived entirely as consumer electronics or jewellery, just designed with a bit more nuance? And this is where I think supernormal design may provide some really innovative thought. So the story behind Supernormal goes that in 2005, Naoto Fukasawa had designed this series of 3 aluminium stools, and they're on display at the Milan Furniture Fair. And when Fukasawa went to visit the display, he found that people weren't admiring the stools, they were sitting on them. And in an exhibition context, that was quite a strange thing to see, so he admitted to being a little shocked at this. However, that same evening, designer Jasper Morrison called him to congratulate him on this success, what their colleague at the time had referred to as, "Oh, that's supernormal." So finally, this appreciation for objects that fit comfortably into our lives and don't disrupt the atmosphere of them had a name, this idea of supernormal. So what if we designed hearing aids in the same way that we would approach designing other everyday objects that fit comfortably into our lives and don't aim to disrupt the atmosphere? That is, not assimilating or hiding disability, but rather positioning it as part of everyday life. So for the last year, I've been exploring what supernormal design means to me, and I've done this firstly through a massive material exploration. And asking questions like, what feels good when it's worn behind the ear? What materials do people associate and feel different feelings towards? And using design as a very subtle way to change some of these metaphors behind the design of hearing aids. So, for example, instead of pseudo-skin plastics, what about materials that aren't trying to be skin-like? They just have some natural similarities, like woods and corks. And most recently, I've been working with cellulose acetate. That's the material that a lot of glasses are made out of. And glasses are really interesting to me as an example of a prosthetic that we no longer really see as a prosthetic. You can walk into a high street shop now and buy a pair of fake glasses. They've become so fashionable. And this material, when it's worn behind the ear, is instantly recognizable and comfortable there, yet it doesn't disrupt the atmosphere and it doesn't try to be a pair of glasses. It's archetypally still a hearing aid. So for the last year and a half, my research has been asking, what would a supernormal hearing aid look like and who might wear one? And as this whole presentation and talk to you today has kind of been about challenging and hopefully changing the way that we design with and for disability, I want to end on this design manifesto, written by my PhD supervisor, inspired by mine, his, and the work of a select few others at the Atelier of Disability Design and Culture in Dundee. And as is the nature of a manifesto, it really requires a response. So if this work today resonates with you as a designer, a hearing aid wearer, a different labelled person, or a healthcare professional, Let's challenge the narrative and continue the conversation. Thank you.